In August of 1945, two blinding flashes of light brought the deadliest war in human history to a sudden, shocking end. But in doing so, they also changed our world forever. So today, we're going to explore the story of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and how they kicked off the terrifying nuclear age. So let's put ourselves in the summer of 1945. This is the question on every Allied leader's mind. The war in Europe, it's over. But the Empire of Japan shows absolutely no sign of surrendering. I mean, they were fighting with a ferocity that was just inflicting these staggering casualties. The whole world was exhausted by war, but it looked like the final price for peace was going to be horrifically high. And this number, this is really at the heart of the whole decision. Military planners were looking at the idea of a full-scale land invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, and their estimates were just grim. They figured it could result in over 1 million Allied casualties. And that's not even counting the Japanese losses, which were expected to be many, many times higher. You can see why they were desperately looking for another way out. To really get that desperation, you have to understand the reality of the Pacific War. By its final year, the fighting had reached a level of savagery that's almost hard to imagine today. You see, as Allied forces were island hopping their way closer and closer to Japan, the fighting got exponentially more brutal. On islands like Iwo Jima, something like 99% of the Japanese defenders were killed. On Okinawa, it was 94%. This wasn't just resistance, it was a fight to the last man, every single time. And on top of that, there was the threat of a 20 million strong civilian militia ready to defend the home islands. It just painted this terrifying picture of what the war's final act would look like. I mean, just look at these numbers. The horror they were projecting for Operation Downfall is almost impossible to wrap your head around. This was going to be the largest amphibious operation in all of history. Studies estimated up to 4 million Allied casualties and a truly staggering 5 to 10 million Japanese fatalities. When you're faced with numbers like that, the search for an alternative becomes the absolute top priority. And it turns out that alternative was already being built, in total secrecy. It was a weapon that was born from a scientific gamble on a scale the world had never, ever seen before. The Manhattan Project was just this colossal undertaking. It started from the fear that Nazi Germany might develop a nuclear weapon first, and it brought together some of the brightest scientific minds on the planet. This wasn't some small lab. It was basically a city-sized effort spread all across the country with everyone in a desperate race to unlock the power of the atom. So all that work produced two totally different types of atomic bombs. First, you had Little Boy. This one was a simpler, gun-type design that used uranium-235. Then there was Fat Man, a much more complex and powerful implosion-type weapon that used plutonium. These were the two devices that would soon be aimed at two Japanese cities. All right, so the first of these missions got underway on a clear August morning, and in an instant, it would change the course of history for good. Hiroshima was the target. Why? Well, it was a major military headquarters and a critical port that, up until this point, had been mostly untouched by bombing raids. So at 8:15 in the morning local time, the B-29 bomber known as the Enola Gay released Little Boy right over the unsuspecting city as it was just starting its day. This quote from the co-pilot really captures the crew's reaction to the unbelievable sight below them. Down on the ground, survivors reported two things. First, a brilliant, silent flash of light. They called it the Pika. And then, a moment later, a tremendous, deafening boom, the dawn. It was like the sun had just been brought down to Earth. The devastation was, well, it was absolute. The blast and the firestorm that followed wiped out nearly 70% of the city's buildings. And by the end of that year, up to 166,000 people were dead. The vast majority of them were civilians. And yet, unbelievably, Japan still did not surrender. So just 3 days later, they sent a second mission. And this one was just a chaotic, near disaster from the very start. A faulty fuel pump, bad weather over their primary target, dwindling fuel. Everything was going wrong for the B-29 bomber, Boxcar. Then, at the very last second,
A tiny break in the clouds opened up over the secondary target, Nagasaki. It was just enough for the bombardier to drop Fat Man, though it ended up being miles off its intended aim point.
So that shock of the second bomb, plus the fact that the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on the exact same day, that 1-2 punch finally broke the stalemate inside the Japanese government. The end of the war was finally at hand. But for many, the end of the war was really the beginning of a whole new kind of suffering. The survivors, who became known as hibakusha, faced decades of horrible health problems from radiation exposure, cancers, and all sorts of other illnesses. And on top of that, they had to endure this awful social stigma because people were ignorant and afraid that their conditions were somehow contagious. Finally, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito did something no emperor had ever done before. He spoke directly to the nation on the radio. And in his speech announcing the surrender, he specifically mentioned the new and most cruel bomb, saying it was a key reason for ending the war, warning it could lead to the total extinction of human civilization. Those mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't just mark the end of a war. They cast a long, dark shadow over our entire future, kicking off a new era that would be defined by their very existence. And that legacy is, to put it mildly, deeply controversial. On one hand, supporters argue that the bombs were a military necessity. They say they saved more lives than they took by preventing that bloody invasion. On the other hand, critics argue that it was an immoral act against a nation that was already on the verge of surrender, and maybe even a political power play to intimidate the Soviet Union at the dawn of the Cold War. And honestly, that debate is still raging today. But what isn't debatable is what happened next. The American monopoly on nuclear weapons, it only lasted 4 years. What followed was the Cold War arms race, which saw the world's arsenals just explode, going from only 2 bombs in 1945 to a terrifying peak of over 64,000 in the mid-80s. Now, today, that number has come down a lot, thank goodness, but the destructive power is all still there. The exclusive nuclear club that started with just 1 member back in 1945 has now grown to 9 nations. It's just a permanent feature of our world now. Which really leaves us with the central paradox of the nuclear age, doesn't it? The events of August 1945 unleashed a power that was capable of ending the world's greatest war. But in doing so, they also gave us a power with the potential to extinguish the world itself. And that is the dual and deeply unsettling legacy of the bomb.